everyone. Today I am talking about felting your knitting or crochet. This is also sometimes called fulling, and it's shrinking sweaters on purpose. We are going to be talking all about felting. That is shrinking sweaters on purpose. Or anything, shrinking rugs, shrinking slippers, whatever the thing is that you have made out of wool and you want to shrink it and make it denser. This is a common technique that you see for things like slippers to create that really thick, dense fabric that you get going. With slippers, it's also a technique you see in rugs. It's also a technique that you will see in outer garments sometimes, like coats. Basically anything that you want to be really thick and really warm and kind of windproof, felting is going to work well for. So if you see the two pieces that I've got here, you can see kind of the after of what felting does. And I should have probably ironed these, but life's too short. So these were my sample felt pieces, and I would highly recommend, if you ever plan to do this with your knits or crochets, that you create little sample pieces like I have done here, just because you never know exactly how something is going to felt. So I always think doing a little sample is a good option. But today I just wanted to talk through some of the things to keep in mind when you're doing a felted project. Technically, if you are going to create the project first with knitting or crochet or weaving, and then you are going to like put it in the washer and the dryer and shrink it on purpose, generally, sort of technically, that is called fulling. That's not called felting. Technically, felting is either wet felting or needle felting when you're working from the fiber, so before it's yarn. Wet felting or needle felting are true felting, and if you create a fabric with a wool yarn by knitting or crocheting or weaving, and then shrink that down and mat those fibers together once they're already yarn, technically that process is called fulling. But in actuality, the way people use the words, people will say, I'm going to felt this coat. And that means I'm going to take this crocheted coat that I made and shrink it. So I will probably use both words kind of interchangeably today. I do know that there is a difference, but there's also a common usage. So I'll kind of be using both. So the first thing I want to talk about is what fibers felt. So not every single yarn that you would ever knit or crochet something with would felt. There are lots and lots and lots of yarns that if you put them in the washer and the dryer, they would come out of the dryer the exact same size and the exact same sort of toughness or drapiness as they went in to the washer. The only fibers that will felt in the washer and the dryer are animal fibers that have not been chemically treated to be superwash. And then there's an asterisk. There's a very few number of animal fibers that have not been treated that are also not feltable. But basically, wool. A non-superwash wool is the vast majority of the time that you're talking about felting. You are talking about felting a wool yarn that came from a sheep. Any breed of sheep will felt. And you're talking about one that has not been chemically or mechanically treated to be superwash. So if the label says superwash wool, that is not going to felt, because superwash means it has been treated so that it will not felt. It won't shrink when it goes in the washer and the dryer. So any thing that comes from a sheep, so that's going to be like your Merino, your Corriedale, your Shetland, your BFL, anything that comes from a sheep at all, is that as long as it does not say superwash, that is always going to felt. Anything that comes from any of the camelids, so that's alpaca, that's llama, that's camel, anything from that family, they haven't actually figured out a way to chemically or mechanically treat those fibers to make them superwash, to make them machine washable without felting. So every single one of those is going to felt. The same thing for Angora, which comes from a rabbit. That is also going to felt. so is mohair going to felt. So most of the time, if it comes from an animal and it does not say superwash somewhere on the label, it's going to felt. The little asterisk is for cashmere. Cashmere doesn't felt. If it's 100% cashmere, and it really is cashmere, it will not felt. I put my cashmere sweaters through the washing machine and the dryer for 10 years and they have never felted. Cashmere is an animal fiber that doesn't have any of the little like rough edges on the fiber, like on the individual strands of hair. Those little like grabby hooks are what create the felt. Cashmere doesn't have that. That's why it feels so nice and soft. And it won't felt. It's like automatically, it was created by the animal and grown out of the animal to be a machine washable, machine dryable fiber. That is also true for silk. So whether you consider silk an animal product or not, silk comes from a silkworm. Silk is not a feltable fiber. So cashmere, silk, don't felt. Everything else that comes from an animal, as far as I know, is going to be feltable, as long as it does not say the word superwash. If it says superwash, don't felt with it. That's not going to felt. That was designed to not shrink. So that's what will felt. The second question is, what exactly is felt? And felt is, if you think about your yarn, your strand of yarn is created by lots and lots and lots, hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of individual strands of hair from whatever animal they happen to come from. If you've ever seen those shampoo commercials where they show you like, this is your damaged hair, this is your hair after you've washed with whatever shampoo. If you think about what the damaged hair is always shown as, it's like a tube with little prongies or little like scales on the outside of it. Well, that is what sheep hair looks like too. That's what alpaca hair, that's what the hair or fur that comes from animals, that's what the individual single strands of that hair look like too. So when you get a yarn, you have, let's say, 100 of those running long ways along the arm. Well, each individual one string has all of those little scales on it. Almost think of it like pine cones, like those little like ribbly bits along the edge of the pine cones. So when those get exposed to heat plus agitation, along with water. So it's warm, it's wet, and it's moving around. Those individual little scales are going to go across each other and they're going to sort of nest down into each other and sink closer and closer in together. And if you think about, there's 100 strands of hair that run along one length, one little section of yarn. That's what felt is. Felt is those individual hairs catching against each other and like nesting down into each other. And that's what makes them shrink, and that's what makes them get thicker and firmer and change texture and all of that stuff. So we know what felt is made from, we know what it is. The next question is, okay, I know all of that. I would like to make a piece that is felted. So I would like to create a piece that I plan to put through the washing machine and the dryer and have it shrink and nest down and change structure like that. How do I need to change my pattern, or what do I need to look for in a pattern to make that happen? And the answer for that is if you choose a pattern that was created to be felted, you can kind of plug and play. I would recommend using a similar yarn to the one the pattern called for, because they have assumed that that felt is going to shrink the same amount or a certain amount because of the yarn that they've chosen. If you choose any yarn you want, it may or may not be similar in terms of how exactly it's going to shrink compared to the yarn that they used. So if you're using a pattern that was designed to be felted, you're going to want to choose a yarn that's similar-ish in terms of it's made from the same animal fiber, maybe it has the same number of plies, so are there 2 strands twisted together, or are there 3 strands twisted together, it's the same or a similar kind of thickness, all of that stuff. so that your piece is going to shrink at about the same rate that the pattern was written, assuming that your piece was going to shrink. If you want to go wild and sort of make it up as you go along, or use a different pattern that wasn't necessarily designed to be felted and choose to felt it, that's what I'm doing with this piece, which is what we talked about last week. You're going to need to do a little bit of math. So get prepared, pull your calculator out and your like paper and pencil. I'm a big fan of math on paper and pencil. And you are going to want to do a swatch for a felted piece more so than any other piece that you would ever do. So last Wednesday, for our technique chat, I talked all about swatches and when you use them and why and all of that stuff. Or a couple of weeks ago, I did that with swatches. Last week, I guess I talked all about using your yarn scraps, but 2 weeks ago, it was all about swatches. You are going to want to create a swatch. You are going to want to measure the swatch before you wash it and dry it, because you want to know how big was this before I started? How big was it before I shrunk it? And you're also going to want to make a note of how many stitches across did you do and how many rows tall did you do. And you can see once this is felted, it actually gets a lot harder to count those things because they kind of all smoosh together and things are not as clear once they're felted. So you definitely want to measure before you felt and write it down. So my highly sophisticated writing method, you just want to write down for this one, which is the one that I did for my first kid's wool coat that I'm making. I did 18 double crochets across and I did 8 rows of them. And so I measured it before I threw it in the washing machine, and it measured 6.5 inches wide and 5 3/4 inches tall. And so I measured that, I wrote it down, I counted how many stitches and how many rows, so I had all of the possible information. And then I threw this in the washing machine with just a regular load of laundry with other stuff in it. And then I threw it in the dryer. And then I did that again because things will felt more as you put it through more times. So there is a point at which you felted it as much as it's going to felt. You shrunk it down and made it denser as much as the fiber can physically do that. And it will not shrink any more than that. But you don't know where that point is until you hit it. So I would always recommend felting your swatch. Go through at least 2 cycles of the washing machine and the dryer. And if you're like me and you do 2 loads of laundry every single day of your life, because I have 2 children and myself and my husband who make lots and lots of dirty clothes, I would say do it through twice, measure it, do it through 2 more times and measure it again and see, is it done shrinking? Is it still shrinking a little bit every time? Because you don't know if you shrunk it all the way until it stops shrinking for several times through. So run it through several times and then you're going to measure it again. So after 2 times through the washing machine and then through the dryer and then through the washing machine and then through the dryer, now it measures 6 inches wide. So it shrunk 1/2 inch. It went from 6.5 inches wide to 6 inches wide. And it went from 5 3/4 inches tall to 5 inches tall. So it shrunk, but it didn't shrink absolutely tons. And importantly, it didn't shrink exactly the same amount sideways as it did up and down. So those are all things that matter. Generally, felt shrinks more up and down than it does side to side. So what you'll find if you follow a pattern for a sweater, like let's say I was going to make this, and I was just making a sweater. I just followed the exact instructions for making a sweater, but I thought I'm gonna felt this when I'm done. The issue becomes, and this is true for knit and it's true for crochet, both, is the sweater is not really going to shrink tons around. So the sweater is not really going to get narrower. It will a tiny bit, but not very much. So it's going to stay about the same around the garment. Where you're going to get a lot more shrinking is going to be up and down. So what happens if you make a sweater and then you think, oh, the sweater's a bit too big, I'll just felt it just a little bit. What happens is your sweater doesn't really get smaller around, is what most people want. They say my sweater's a little bit too big. They mean they want it to come in the sides to get narrower. It doesn't really do that very much. What it does a lot more is it shrinks up and down. So what often happens if someone makes a sweater without planning to felt it and then says, okay, I'm going to felt this now, what ends up happening is you get a boxy sweater that's a little bit on the wide side. That's a crop top because it's shrunk more up and down, and the sleeves have shrunk more up and down. So you get a crop top with 3/4 length sleeves that's still too wide if you don't plan for the amount of shrinking. So what I did for this one, because I kind of did make this up as I went along, but it was intentional. So what I ended up doing with this sweater is for my kiddo, and I measured the kid that I wanted to put in the finished sweater, and I measured him around, and him like around the waist, around the chest, is 21 inches around. He's 3, so he's pretty small. Well, he's a giant 3-year-old, but he's not an adult size. 21 inches around. And so what I did is I said, okay, well, after this has shrunk as much as it's going to shrink, 18 double crochet stitches across is 6 inches wide. And so I did all my math from that. Of, okay, I have 6 inches wide is 18 double crochets. He's 21 inches around. This becomes like an elementary school math problem at this point of how many double crochets do I need to make 21 inches around. The only extra thing that comes in that makes this a little bit more complicated than an elementary school math problem is his body measures 21 inches around. I do not want his wool coat to measure 21 inches around because he's going to be wearing a shirt and maybe a sweater underneath that, and he's going to want to be able to put it on and take it off easily because he's a kid and it's a coat. So I looked at a lot of charts to see how many inches extra in size do I want his coat than his body. And what I personally decided on was 8 inches. So I said his body measures 21 inches. I want it to be 8 inches bigger around than his body so that it's easy for him to put it on over a sweater and shirt, and I'm hoping that he can even wear this like maybe next year too. So 21 inches around plus 8 inches bigger than that equals 29 inches. So now it is, if 18 inches or 18 double crochets is 6 inches wide, after it's finished shrinking, how many double crochets do I need around to get to 29 inches? And the answer is this many. I did the math, but then I didn't write it down. So I did the math. It's on my like cheat sheet inside, but I don't actually know what the number is. If you know, put it in the comments below. And that means I know right now, when I tried this on the kid, it's comedy too large. It looks like he's wearing a grown-up sweater. That's just way, way too big for him. But I know that this is going to shrink. I know it's going to get a little bit smaller around, and it's going to get quite a bit shorter, which is why it's kind of too long right now. It looks too long. The proportions look a little bit off. And that will be true when you're dealing with felting, knitting, and crochet. When you just hold the piece up and look at it, you'll think the proportions are wrong. Like my slippers are too, like they're too long. They're going to come up too far up my leg. And it's just because they felt more up and down than they do side to side. So the only other thing to talk about is physically and actually doing the felting process. So once you've got the yarn that you need to create the project, you know you've got a yarn that will felt, you know how the felt actually works, you've done your felting of your sample piece so that you know how much it's going to shrink in each direction so that you can modify the pattern a little bit if you need to. The last thing is, okay, I've finished it, I'm completely done. How do I actually felt this thing? And the answer is, I would highly recommend a washing machine. A washing machine with as much agitation, that just means moving around, as you can get. So if you have a top-loading washing machine, especially if you have an old top-loading washing machine, those are great. You get lots of agitation going on in there. You want one that has that center column. And all you want is something that's it's gonna wiggle your clothes around a lot as it's working. If you have a front loader or like a newfangled top loader that doesn't have that center bar, it's very, very gentle on clothes. That's fantastic for every single other thing that you would ever wash in it. But it's terrible for felting because you need that agitation. So if you have a front loader, or if you have a very fancy or newfangled top loader that doesn't have a center bar, or a center, whatever that post thing is, see if you've got a friend or a family member that lives nearby, or a laundromat, something that you can do, something that's going to really agitate it. And you want to set the settings on that machine for as hot as you can get it. So if you've got the option of like warm or hot, or even like a boil wash, if you have like a disinfectant setting, as hot of water as you can get, that's what you want. And as much wiggling as you can get is what you want. So this is not the time for the delicate cycle, like permanent press, heavy duty, whatever option like that you have. You want this to be agitated, shook around as much as possible. If you've got a like hot warm cycle, you want to change the temperature as much as you can. So go from hot to cold, like that super quick change from temperatures is going to help it felt a little bit more. If you have a really old pair of sneakers, or like a load of laundry to do that's blue jeans, something that's kind of tough and gonna rumble tumble around in there with it, throw the piece that you're going to felt along with that, along with your old pair of tennis shoes that you're happy to send through the washer, or tennis balls that you're happy to send through the washer, or like your load of blue jeans, something that's gonna like rub up against it and tumble around with it and give it that extra agitation is gonna be beneficial. And then you want to throw it in the dryer after it comes out of the washing machine. Again, as hot a cycle as you can get, as rough and tumble a setting as you've got. Throw the tennis balls in with it, or the tennis shoes in with it, or the blue jeans in with it. Something that it's going to tumble against and have that extra friction and rubbing. All of those things are going to felt it more effectively. You're going to felt it faster doing all of those things. And if you're saying, I don't want to run a special load, so for something like this is big, it wouldn't be ridiculous to run this through on its own load. I mean, it would be a little bit silly, but it wouldn't be ludicrous. But like when you're doing your samples, your swatches, it would be really silly to put like this in a load of laundry by itself. Just throw it in with whatever load you happen to be doing. If you have pristine laundry, which we do not, so if you do like a white load or a delicate load where if the colors from your yarn or like a couple of the little fibers from your felting piece ended up doing a tiny bit of like dyeing or rubbing against and agitating, and that would disturb you with the other things in there, do it with, like I said, do it with blue jeans, do it with like your kids' sports equipment, whatever you're washing like that. Because the same things that create good felting also are prime places for dyes to bleed. If you're working with something that the color is going to bleed, it's going to bleed when you're felting it. So like red and blue are the most quintessentially like bleeding colors. You better believe I am not doing this with like my white linen napkins because this is going to dye everything pink. So this goes in with blue jeans. You can't tell if they're dyed pink. So those are kind of the how-to. And if you don't feel like you got a lot of change the first time through, you feel like that doesn't really look much different than when I started with. And I think you can tell, I mean, I can tell a huge difference between the two in terms of how dense my fabric is. But if the first time through it doesn't seem like enough happened, throw it through again. And the dryer may often create more of that felting effect than the washing machine will. So if you pull it out of the washer and think this looks exactly the same as when I put it in the dryer before you measure it. And I think you'll be happier with that. My one last caveat, I felt, I don't know, a couple times a year I'll do a felting project at our house, and I use our totally standard washer and dryer. That is what we do all of our laundry on, nothing fancy. It was free and it came from my cousin, and we've had it for years, and it works just fine. If you get incredibly into felting, like you open up an Etsy store and you're creating felting purses, like felted purses, 10 a week kind of a thing, you may wreck your washer if you do tons of this. The little bit of fibers that come off of these things, if you're doing absolutely tons, they are shedding into your washer. In your dryer, you may need to clean them more. If you're doing absolutely tons, you may get more wear and tear on your washing machine than you would doing regular stuff. But like I said, truly, I had my last washer and dryer for 10 years, and I did a couple of felting projects a year in it, and it worked fine for 10 years. I've had this set for 6 years, and it was secondhand when I got it, and I do a couple of felting projects a year, and it works just fine. So don't get freaked out about that. But if you get incredibly into felting, it's just worth noting, clean the lint traps on your washer and your dryer. Don't burn your house down or destroy your washing machine because you're not checking those for the extra lint and wear and tear and stuff. So I hope that this was helpful. I think that doing felted projects are fun. This, by the way, is the swatch. I'm going to make the same wool coat for my other kid, and these are her colors that she picked. So that's why I figured I would do both swatches at the same time. So I hope that you guys enjoy doing it. I have seen a lot of really, really neat fold projects like this where I've done several with knitting. We actually have a pattern called the Bobbly Bag. It's one of my original designs up on Ravelry. I have about 120 of them. And that was felting a knitted bag to create like a tote bag size. And that shrunk a lot to the point where before I put it through the washer and the dryer, I could climb my whole body inside this bag, which was quite fun. Because it then got so much smaller, it became just sort of tote bag size. And then this piece is crocheted, both of my swatches are crochet. So knit or crochet, either one, your fulling process is going to work similarly. So I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening. I hope your day was less stressful than mine. I took my soon-to-be kindergartner back to school shopping for the first time in my life, because it's our first kid starting kindergarten in about 3 weeks. So I've been in a very back to school, need the stuff for the fall and all of that place, which is why if you're thinking, why is she making wool coats in July? It's because school starts in August now. You know you're old when you're like, back in my day, school used to start in the end of September, which it did. But enjoy the rest of your evening, make some cool fiber art things, and I will see you next Wednesday